is lesson 12 on worship. It's part 8. I want to talk a little bit about giving. The subject of giving has always been a touchy subject. It doesn't seem like it's as much now as it used to be. I remember back years ago, I'd get fussed on quite a bit if I talked about giving much. But that doesn't happen as much anymore. I don't know why. I'm glad it's that way, though. But it's always been a touchy subject. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes I think one of the biggest reasons is people don't understand why the subject of giving is a big matter, why it really matters all that much. What does the church really do that takes so much money? And why do preachers harp on it all the time? I've heard some through the years, every time a preacher preaches on giving, it's because he wants a raise. His raise is coming around, and he wants to bump up the weekly income to help his raise out a little bit. I can assure you that's not what I'm trying to do. What I hope to do is to help educate us on giving. God is a giver, and you and I want to be givers also. Our hope is to be like God. It's what we're supposed to do, Romans 8:29. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. We are to be like God, become like God. We didn't start out that way, but we're moving in that direction slowly but surely. And one of the things we have to accomplish in order to be like God is to be a giver, a giving person. It's a very critical thing. We read a lot about giving, this subject, with the church at Corinth. It was read just a few moments ago. Paul the Apostle discusses giving in both Corinthian letters. But in the first letter, I want to draw your attention to, first of all, this congregation was riddled with all kinds of problems, the church at Corinth. They had a lot of sins going on in that church. And because they did, this chapter, this book, divides itself into two major sections. The first section is chapters 1 through 6. And what you notice as you read it is that Paul talks about the sins in the church. He addresses those sins, and he dresses them down because of those sins. The sins that were being committed were what we would consider very vile sins. One man, for example, had his father's wife. You don't do stuff like that. And here it was a Christian of all people doing it. But there were other problems as well, and Paul discussed those sins. But as you get to chapter 7, he's going to change the direction. What happened was they had wrote him a letter, and they asked him a lot of questions on a variety of different subjects, and they wanted him to give them answers to their questions. And that's what he does in chapters 7 through 16. He responds to their questions. By his answer, you can pretty much anticipate what their question was. And it's within that realm of questions that the subject of giving came up. But I want to show you how it developed. In chapter 7, verse 1, Paul begins the second part saying, "Now concerning the things which you wrote to me." And these are the various subjects. They wanted to know about the Lord's Supper. They wanted to know about speaking in tongues. They had a lot of questions about the resurrection from the dead. And they were asking him all them questions, and he's giving them various answers. When you get to chapter 16 and verse 1, he says, "Now, at this time," been answering all these other questions, "now, concerning or in regard to your question regarding the collection," that's the weekly giving, "for the saints." That is, for the saints in Jerusalem. They were taking up money at this particular time for the poor saints in Jerusalem and Judea. The saints down there were suffering a great deal of hardship. It wasn't going to be long before the Roman legions would go into Jerusalem. They would seize the city, and it would fall to the ground by the time they got done. They were going to destroy that city, destroy most of the people, and they would take some back to Rome as a prize. But during this period, before the advance of the Roman legions actually started, the Christians, especially the Christians, were suffering horrible conditions. Number one, because they were Christians, and number two, because they were Jews. So they were kind of getting it on both sides. They were getting it from the Romans, and they were getting it from the Jews. So there was a collection that was being taken up around the world. The brethren were collecting monies, and they were taking those monies down to Jerusalem. Paul's job in all this was to carry the money down there for them. And this is what he's talking about. They've asked him a question. What about this money we're taking up to go down to Jerusalem? Can you tell us something about that? And this is what he's talking about. Well, concerning that question, he goes on to say, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. In other words, this was a universal instruction. He was giving the same instruction to all the churches. They were all going to be bound by the same rule when it came to the subject of giving on the first day of the week. On the first day of the week, which was a special day in the New Testament, in Mark chapter 16, verse 29, for example, Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 1, we learn that the church he built began on the first day of the week. In Revelations chapter 1 and verse 10, John the Apostle said, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, which was the first day of the week. By that time, by the end of the first century, the first day of the week had come to be known as the Lord's Day among the Christians because of its history. The fact that Jesus was raised on that day, the church began on that day, and so many very important events took place on the first day of the week. And of course, in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, it was on the first day of the week when the disciples came together to eat the Lord's Supper, like we'll do shortly. It was on this particular day. So the first day of the week was a special day to Christians in the first century. It's very obvious to all Bible students because it plays a prominent part in our history and in our worship as well. But on this day, this first day of the week, when the saints come together to eat the Lord's Supper, let each one of you, every Christian, each Christian is to lay something aside. Now that little phrase, lay something aside, can be a little bit misleading. It means to lay by him, or probably more accurately, lay by itself. Lay by him is the way the King James and the American Standard Versions translate it. The English Standard Version has put something aside. Upon the first day of the week, let each one of you put something aside, a piece of money, okay? Then he goes on to say, storing up. Now that phrase, storing up, is translated in the King James, the American Standard, as in store. The English Standard Version has store it up. Literally, it means put into the treasury, okay? So what Paul is actually telling the brethren to do is on the first day of the week, each one of you put something aside from your money. And then you take it with you to the church and put it into the church coffers. That's what you do. You set it aside before you leave home. You determine what you ought to do, what you ought to give, and then when you go to the congregation, then you put that money into the church treasury. So that's the literal understanding of his command. And do this as you may prosper, as you are faring in life. Of course, our prosperity includes everything we do. Our grocery bill is part of our prosperity. You know, we're buying food to eat. Some have tried to minimize it by saying it's all you got left after all the bills are paid. Well, you know, if it wasn't for BR, I could arrange things in such a way that by the time my bills are paid, I wouldn't have any money left. Because I know a lot of stuff I'd like to purchase, but she puts the brakes on me and took the checkbook away from me. And I don't do stuff like that anymore. But what we're supposed to do, given what we make, given to our incomes, we are to lay a piece of money aside according to what we prosper as a wage earner. The reason, as far as this particular thing was concerned, that there be no collections when I come. When Paul came to Corinth, for example, He didn't want to have to go house to house to house to house to take up the money from individual Christians. Put it in the church treasury. This way, when I come into the city of Corinth, I can go to the church, I can collect the money, and I can get back on the road again. He had a lot of churches he had to visit, and he didn't want to be stopping at house to house to house. Therefore, you lay it aside on the first day of the week that there'll be no collections when I come. And to this day, that's the way churches still do. We still follow that rule. It's an easy enough rule to understand, and it's one that most all religious bodies live by, as far as I know of at least. Also in the Corinthian epistle, he talks about the generous spirit of the Macedonians. When you want to learn about the kind of a spirit a good giver ought to have, always remember 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. Notice what Paul says. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. He's writing to the church of Corinth again. This is a second letter. Well, really it's a third. But he says, I want you to know what a good giver is all about. That's what he's saying. That's what he wants them to understand. We make known to you the grace of God that has been bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. In other words, the churches of Macedonia they abounded in the grace of God as God did. They were extremely gracious people. God had been gracious to them. He forgave them of their sins, and he had blessed them in a variety of different ways, and it rubbed off. They became gracious themselves. They appreciated the grace they had received, and now they were doing likewise to others. He said, I want you to see what the grace of God looks like when it's living in the heart of the children of God. In a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy for what God had done for them, coupled with their deep poverty, they were an extremely poor people, didn't have much money in their area where they lived. Nevertheless, they abounded in the riches of their liberality, in their giving. Okay? They were, even though they were greatly afflicted with a very deep poverty, because they were so full of joy for what God had done for them, they abounded in what they delivered to Paul when he came there to collect the funds. I bear witness that according to their ability, what they had, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing to give. The fact that he says beyond their ability seems to imply that he might have tried to dissuade them from giving so much. Apparently, Paul thought they were giving too much. There is a possibility of giving too much, I think, especially if you do injury to your family. If your family is going to suffer because you give everything away, if your family is going to starve to death because you've given everything away, I think there's a possibility of actually doing injury to yourself if you are too free-spirited. And it could be that Paul thought these folks might have been just a little too generous. And he may have tried to dissuade them, but it doesn't matter because they weren't backing up. They had decided what they were going to give, and they were going to give it. They were freely willing. They knew they didn't have to. They knew they weren't obliged to, but they wanted to do it anyway because God had provided them with an opportunity to do good, imploring us, begging us to take it with much urgency because the matter was dire. The situation was serious. They implored us with much urgency over and over and over again that we would receive their gift, the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. This is the spirit of the grace of God living in the heart of the Christian. And not only, as we had hoped, did they give, but they had first given themselves to the Lord, and then to us by the will of God. He's giving us a little key to the secret of good giving. They had first given themselves to the Lord. If you give yourself to God, it's only natural that he gets everything you've got to boot. Isn't that right? If you give God yourself, doesn't he get your house, your car, and everything else you've got anyway? This is what the apostle's alluding to. They have truly given themselves to the Lord, and it was for them, it was a small matter to chip in to try to help the poor saints in Jerusalem, as God willed the brotherhood would do. So we urge Titus that as he had begun, so he would also complete this grace in you as well. Titus was going before Paul. He was making sure the brethren had collected the funds that are necessary so that when Paul got there wouldn't have to be a collection with all the other brethren watching on. So we urged Titus to come to you to make sure that you were prepared when I got there. But as you abound in everything, you brethren, you abound in your faith, you abound in speech, you have abounded in knowledge, you abound in diligence, you've abounded in your love for us. As you have abounded in everything that you do, see that you abound in this grace also. Abound, overflowing, generous, perhaps in some people's eyes to a fault. The danger. There is a danger to wealth and poverty that has to be understood. We see what the Spirit of the grace of God looks like in the heart of the Christian. But there's also a danger to both wealth and poverty. I guess it depends on how you look at it. Solomon gives us a little bit of insight in Proverbs 30, verses 8 and 9. Look at what he says to God. Give me neither poverty nor riches. I don't want to be rich and I don't want to be, dirt poor. I'd rather be somewhere in the middle. Feed me with the food allotted to me. Feed me the food that I need, no more, no less, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Sometimes if we're wealthy, we get to the point where we don't need God. We got money. Money takes care of our problems. If we get sick, we buy a doctor. A doctor comes and he'll make us well. If we run out of food, we go purchase food. We got money. If we got money, we can get whatever we need, and we don't really see our need for God as much. And this is what Solomon is saying. Make sure I don't have too much money. I may get too full, and I may deny my need for the Lord. And on the other hand, if I'm so poor, I may start stealing, and in the process profane the name of my God. Whether rich or poor, both can be detrimental. Sometimes we think, the rich person is the person who's got all the problems. Well, a poor person's got a lot of problems too, because a poor person can turn away from God the same as a rich person can. That's one of the reasons why I think the Bible describes the word rich. It's not an amount of money, it's the fact of wanting money. For example, a man who has $1 can be a rich man in his own eyes. There's not really a dollar value. Any person who trusts in riches is a person who has a lot of problems, whether he has little riches or many riches. If he trusts in riches, he's not going to trust in God, and therein his problem lies. There's a problem with wealth, and those who study the Scriptures know that's true. Over and over and over again, we're warned constantly about the danger of wealth. I've been told, I haven't read it myself, but I have been told that 1 out of 4 verses in the Bible deals with the subject of money or property, something to that effect, our having or not having wealth. So it's a subject that's really worth our attention, because it's possible that I may not give as the Lord wants me to give because of my attitude towards money. I might like it too much, or I might be afraid to have to do without it because I'm not able to trust God without a certain amount of dollars in my bank account. Both can be detrimental. The Lord asked once, will a man rob God? And he said, you have robbed me, speaking to the Israelites. Would a man rob God? No, of course not. And God says, well, you have robbed me. But you say to me, in what way have we robbed you, God? In tithes and offerings you've robbed me. There's a certain amount that has been allotted to me, but you didn't want to give it to me, and therefore you didn't. And God said, by doing that, you've actually robbed me. You took from me what was mine because you wanted to keep it for yourself. So it becomes a very serious matter as we stop and think about it. Paul said to command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty or to be high-minded, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but to trust in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give and willing to share. There's a danger to our wealth, and we have to understand that danger when we're thinking about what we're going to give to the Lord. I'll probably expand this sermon another week, in about 2 or 3 weeks, because I want to show you that the money aspect of our giving is almost it's very, very insignificant in comparison to what we are to give to God in the big picture. The secret to successful giving, I think, is explained by Paul. If you read his instructions to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, you're going to notice one thing that's missing. He says our giving should be a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. And the reason being because God loves a cheerful giver. He wants us to give because we want to. You know, you don't want people to give you something because they have to. I remember when I got promoted at work one time, it was our custom every Christmas you would buy a supervisor a Christmas gift. And I'd been working there for a while, and I'd watch everybody bellyache and fuss about buying a supervisor a Christmas gift. And the first rule I made when I got promoted is no Christmas gifts. I don't want nobody buying me something if they're going to bellyache about it. They don't want to. Do you? Well, the Lord doesn't want it either. Our giving should be a matter of generosity, not a grudging obligation, something we have to do that we don't want to do. Our giving should be because of the exceeding grace of God that is in you, because God has given you, and now you want to give to others. You want to reciprocate. You've been treated well, now you want to treat well. It's an appreciation of what God has done for us. That's what a good giver is. A good giver understands the magnitude of God's gift to them. And because God has given them 10,000 times more than they could ever get back to Him, they want to give what they can. And they do. It's an act of appreciation. But notice, Paul, I speak not by commandment. Show me, he's saying, where I commanded you to give. He doesn't. You'll notice that absent from his instructions. He doesn't command them in their giving. That's not the way he approached the subject. Why? Well, it's not going to really do any good, is it? If he commands them, you got to give 10% or you got to give 15%, is that going to really do any good? What if a person, okay, I got to give 10%, and they pull out the old checkbook and write out 10%? What do you got here? You got a begrudging giver. You're defeating the purpose. So he's not giving any such commands. He's not ordering them what to do. He's feeding them advice. He's advising them as to what they to do. I speak not by commandment. I'm giving you my advice. Here's what you need to think about. Here's what you want to think about. That's important. If there is first a willing mind, the gift is accepted according to what one has, and not according to what he does not have. If there is a willing mind, God accepts the gift. But what if the person isn't willing? What if they begrudge it? What if they're stingy or covetous? The Lord doesn't even accept it. You might as well keep it, because He's not going to have it. It's like the Israelites of old when they were offering up all these blood sacrifices to Jehovah. He said, keep it. I don't need your blood. I'm God. I've got all kinds of animals. They're all mine. Everything belongs to me. I don't need your leftovers. Keep it if it's that important to you. And that's basically what it comes down to with money. Paul's saying, I'm not commanding you to do this. I'm giving you my advice. If there is first a willing mind, if you want to do unto others as God has done unto you, then God will accept your gift. Whether you don't have much, doesn't matter. Regardless of what one has or what he does not have, it doesn't matter. A man who's got a lot may give a lot. A man who's got a little may give a little. It doesn't matter. Because if there's first a willing mind, God accepts both gifts equally. on the same footing. The guy who gives $1,000 a week isn't any more in the eyes of God than the guy who gives $10. It could be the guy giving $1,000 isn't even giving enough. But this is what Paul's wanting to get through to the brethren. He wants them to understand it's got to be a matter of the heart. So many times, I've said it myself, I wish the Lord would have said, give 10%, give 15%, give 20%, whatever it is you want. Just tell us what you want. It would be so much easier to just write a check. Take my computer, figure out what 20% of my income is, and write a check. It would be easy. But it's not accomplishing what the Lord wants to accomplish. He wants us to do it because we want to do it. And if we don't want to do it, there's no reason to do it. Because we don't get credit for it. It doesn't make God happy. And therefore, show the proof of your love. That's what I did a few moments ago. And that's what you did. We all showed the proof of our love. Not to one another. We show God how much we love Him. We show by how we give. And that's what Paul's saying. I'm not giving you a command. I'm giving you advice. Here's what's happening when you give. You're showing God how much you love Him. And boy, when you look at it that way, that really puts it in a different light, doesn't it? Because now I'm wondering, how does God feel about my love for Him? Does He feel bad? Does He feel hurt? I don't know. Acceptable giving, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. It's very difficult. I'm going to cut it off here. It's difficult. I think the number one reason why it's so difficult is because of our doubts. I honestly believe that. But I believe because of our doubts, we find it very hard to give as we would give if we didn't have the doubts we have. For example, will the Lord take care of me? He said He will. I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. Matthew 28:20. Hebrews 13:5 and 6. The Lord is my helper. I have no reason to fear. The Lord is always looking out for me and my business. He's going to make sure that I'm protected. He's going to make sure that I'm cared for. Now, if all those things are true, money doesn't have to be a real big priority in my life. I mean, I want to make money and make as much as I can while I'm making it. But, I mean, I'm not going to lose my soul over something like money. Because the Lord's going to take care of me, ultimately. I don't have to keep X amount of dollars in my savings account in case something goes wrong. Perhaps the Lord won't let nothing go wrong. And if something does go wrong, can't the Lord help me to get past it? Isn't He capable of doing things like that? Can't He help us get around our difficulties? We see it all the time throughout the Scriptures. We have promise after promise after promise. But do we believe it? Do we believe it? That the Lord can do what He said He would do. And then there's some other doubts that we have. What if all this stuff isn't true? What if it's not true? What if God is not true? What if heaven is not true? I'm living this life I'm living the way I'm living it, and I'm missing out on a whole lot of fun out there in the world. There's a lot of stuff I could be doing that I'm not doing. What if it's not true? Can you imagine what all I'm missing out on? If Christ isn't raised from the dead, we are the most pathetic people on the planet. Because we're living the biggest hoax that's ever been perpetrated. And it's all for nothing. And it's hard to give. Because I'm not convinced this isn't all for nothing. What if we die and it's as Jehovah's Witnesses say, we're dead as dogs? What if they got it right? Where does that leave me then? I've spent my life spending myself for something that wasn't even real. I can't imagine being a bigger fool than that. And it makes it hard to give. Makes it hard to give. Just in case. Just in case it's not for real. I'd like to do this and I'd like to do that. At least I can come out of this world with a little something in my memory. Doubts, I think, are the biggest obstacle we face. And it causes us a lot of problems. In the way we live, in the way we give ourselves to the Lord, and in the way we give what we have to the Lord. Because until we're sure that He's telling us the truth, and we can count on it, I think we're always going to have reservations as to whether or not the things we're doing are in vain. The Hebrews author said, without faith it is impossible to please God. I think that's what he's talking about. Without faith, we don't have enough reason to try to please God. Without a strong confidence that God is and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Without a strong consolation, we just don't have enough reason to follow Him the way He wants us to follow Him. And therefore we don't. We don't get as involved with the church as we could. We don't get involved with the works of the church like we could. We're not really involved in trying to exhort, to admonish one another as we could be. But if we were convicted that God is and that His promises are true, our lives would be lived completely different. It's hard sometimes to look into the mirror of the Scriptures because we see things about ourselves that we don't like. It happens to me all the time. And it happens to you too. But the reason we go through examinations like this is so that we can take a good close look at ourselves, see our strengths, see our weaknesses, and then try to shore up our weaknesses. Where I realize I'm weak, I need to invest myself a little bit more. And one of the best ways, I think, to invest ourselves into the kingdom of God is to be invested in it ourselves. In other words, give yourself to the Lord. That's what Paul told the saints at Corinth. The Macedonians first gave themselves to the Lord. And then the money was nothing. That was nothing. Giving yourself to God is much more difficult than giving your money to God, because yourself is all you got. I want to go to heaven, and I trust you do too. So let me suggest this. Let's, to the best of our ability, every day, of every week, of every month, do what we can to get closer and closer and closer to God. Learning to trust Him, to know Him, to understand Him, to love Him, and to walk with Him. We can do it. I know we can do it. Any one of us can do it if we first have a willing mind. But why not do that? And together we can go to heaven and see Zola. And how many other hundreds have we bid farewell to temporarily? If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, please, right now, while we stand and sing,